Welcome to the series I'm calling Sciencing, intended to help you to better understand scientific research and to begin to think about it more critically. This module introduces you to a type of observational study design known as cross-sectional or cross-sectional study design. Now, if you're not familiar with the term observational in the context of research, if it's unclear in some way, please check out the earlier module, simply called Introduction to Quantitative Research Methods. Cross-sectional studies are arguably the simplest, most basic kind of observational study. Cross-sectional studies collect data at one time point. You could also say collect data once from each, let's say, participant. One example of cross-sectional research is the New Zealand census, which happens on one specific day. The time period of data collection is not always quite so limited though. A study may collect data over several weeks or even months, but it will only get the input from each participant once at one time point. And the best way to understand cross-sectional research is to contrast it with longitudinal type research designs where data is collected at multiple time points. In health-related research, cross-sectional studies tend to address questions such as what is the prevalence or distribution of a specific condition, disease, practice, perspective, opinion, and so on. The term prevalence simply refers to how common or rare something is. And it's often reported in a number per 1,000 or per 10,000. But you might see it as a percentage. X number of GPs believe or do whatever we're asking about. Advantages of cross-sectional studies include that they are relatively straightforward. Data from each sample is collected only once. Another advantage is that the prevalence of multiple things, for example, medical conditions, can be collected. And data on multiple exposures and outcomes can also be collected at the same time. And I will go more into what is an exposure, what is an outcome, what do those terms mean in an upcoming module on another observational study design. It's important to remember that correlation does not mean causation, even if a strong correlation exists. So we measure correlation on a scale of 0 to 1, 1 being a perfect fit, 0 being no apparent relationship whatsoever. And what are we talking about there? Maybe we find that as one thing goes up, A goes up, B also goes up. So we look at how closely those two match. Or as A goes down, B goes up. Even if that number is close to 1, let's say 0.9, and we hear those famous words that it's statistically significant, something we'll discuss in a future module. It still doesn't tell us whether the selected exposure, let's call that A, caused the condition of interest B. It may be the exposure led to the condition of interest. Alternatively, the condition of interest may have influenced the exposure. Or there may be some other factor that hasn't been assessed that links both the exposure and the condition of interest, but not in any way where A causes B. It just tends to be that when A is high, C, which maybe causes B, is also high. So the key thing here is just because we see an association doesn't mean we've discovered cause and effect. So key limitations of a cross-sectional approach include that the temporal relationships cannot be studied. What do I mean by that? Time. Did A come before B? Or did B come before A? We're only looking at one time point, so we cannot determine that. They're not suitable to studying things with a short duration. If it's a case of blink and you miss it, probably a cross-sectional study will not help. It does not assess incidence. So while a cross-sectional study can tell us how many people have something or believe something right now, it doesn't tell us the rate at which this grows. It doesn't tell us, let's say we're looking at type 2 diabetes, cross-sectional study might be used to determine how many people in a given area or in a given group have type 2 diabetes, but it doesn't tell us how many more will develop it in the next year and the year after and so on, or even how quickly people developed it in the past. So it doesn't tell us anything about incidence. only prevalence. And the response rates are often low. That's just a fancy way of saying that a lot of people might be asked to fill in, let's say, a questionnaire, but many don't. There is also considerable bias in that often people who do respond have a strong view or a strong opinion one way or the other. So we can get a skewed impression, especially if we are talking about practices or if we're talking about opinions. If you found this useful, hit like and subscribe. Most importantly, keep learning by watching other modules in the series, and there should be some coming up here and here for you to choose from.